Matsyaavatar, the day the waters began to whisper. Dearest gentle viewer, there are stories in which the divine announces its arrival with such magnificence that no mortal could possibly mistake what stands before him. Because the heavens tremble, celestial voices speak, weapons of unimaginable power appear, and kings fall to their knees knowing immediately that they are witnessing something that does not belong entirely to the modern world. But the story I bring you today begins in a manner so quiet and so deceptively ordinary that the man standing at the center of it could never have imagined that the fate of the world had already found its way into his hands. The morning upon which our story begins might have seemed no different from countless mornings that have come before it, and somewhere in that peaceful world where rivers continued to flow within their familiar banks and human beings went about their lives believing that tomorrow would resemble yesterday, there lived a man named Manu who had no reason to suspect that somewhere beyond the boundaries of everything he knew, a catastrophe was approaching that would soon make the world around him almost unrecognizable. Now, Manu approached the water that day without any knowledge of what awaited him. And as he lowered his hands into it, perhaps expecting nothing more extraordinary than the familiar coolness of water against his skin, something small and alive suddenly moved between his palms. When Manu looked down, he saw a tiny fish. Now, there was nothing about the creature that should have commanded the attention of history because it was neither magnificent nor frightening, and it possessed none of the grandeur one might expect from a being destined to become part of one of the great stories of the divine. Which meant that Manu might easily have returned it to the water and walked away without ever discovering that the smallest encounter of his life was about to become the most important. Then, the fish spoke to him. Manu stared at the creature resting within his hands, and although the ancient story does not tell us precisely what expression crossed his face at the moment, one can hardly imagine that even a man of great wisdom would receive the sudden conversation of a fish with perfect composure. Perhaps Manu wondered whether the voice had truly come from the creature before him, and perhaps for a moment he remained perfectly still, waiting to discover whether his own senses had deceived him, until the little fish spoke again and made a request that sounded remarkably simple, considering everything that would eventually follow from it. The fish asked Manu to save its life. It explained that if Manu returned it to the water, the larger fish would devour it because the world beneath the surface was governed by the ancient danger in which the strong consumed the weak, and this tiny creature knew that it possessed little chances of surviving if the man holding it simply opened his hands and allowed it to disappear once more into the water. Manu looked at the little fish that had somehow placed its fate entirely within his hands, and although he could not possibly have known who or what had truly spoken to him, he decided that he would not return the creature seeking protection to a place where it believed death awaited it. He therefore carried the fish away and placed it safely inside a vessel, perhaps believing that whatever strange adventure had begun that morning would now become a rather manageable responsibility. Because there are surely more difficult tasks in the world than keeping one tiny fish alive. Manu could not have known that the creature before him would very soon make the vessel look absurdly small. The fish began to grow. At first, there may have been nothing particularly alarming about this development because the fish grow as all living creatures do. But Manu might simply have noticed that his unusual companion was becoming healthier and larger under his protection. The growth, however, did not stop when ordinary growth ought to have stopped. And before long, the little fish that had once rested comfortably within Manu's hands had become too large for the vessel in which he had placed it. Perhaps Manu looked at the creature with some surprise before deciding that the solution was perfectly obvious, because if the fish required more space, then he would simply provide more space, and so he transferred it into a something larger and continued on with his life. The fish grew again. This time, Manu could no longer dismiss what was happening quite so easily, because the creature had not merely grown but had once again outgrown the place intended to contain it. And the man who had rescued a tiny fish now found himself searching for somewhere large enough to accommodate an ant animal that seemed to increase in size with astonishing speed. Manu moved the fish once more, and perhaps he did so, he began wondering whether there was something very unusual about the creature he had brought into his care. Although even then he could hardly have imagined the truth. The fish continued growing. Every time Manu found a larger place, the creature eventually became too large for it, and with every transformation, the memory of that helpless little fish asking to be saved from larger predators must have seemed increasingly strange. Because the creature that had once feared being swallowed was rapidly becoming something that no ordinary predator could have dared approach. At some point, Manu must have surely have stood before the enormous creature and wondered what exactly had he rescued from the water that day. Because the question could no longer be avoided by finding another vessel or another pond, and the mystery had grown just as dramatically as the fish itself. Now, one might imagine Manu looking directly at the creature and asking how something that had once fitted within his palms could possibly have become so enormous, while another question, considerably more troubling than the first, slowly began to form within his mind. Why had this creature chosen him? The fish could have appeared before anyone, yet it had come into Manu's hands, had spoken specifically to him, and had persuaded him to become its protector, and now it was revealing itself to be something that clearly belonged beyond the ordinary world. Manu understood. The answer would come soon enough, but when it came, Manu would discover that the extraordinary growth of the fish was not even the most astonishing part of what was to happen. The creature knew something. It knew something about the future that Manu did not know, and somewhere beyond these calm waters and the familiar lands surrounding him, a disaster of unimaginable scale was drawing closer. Before the creature that Manu had once carried within his hands had become enormous, and each time he attempted to place it somewhere sufficiently large, the same impossible transformation continued until Manu could no longer believe in the being before him. One can imagine Manu standing near the water and watching the immense creature move before him, while the memory of their first meeting returned with almost unbelievable clarity, because he could still remember the tiny fish that had begged him not to return it to the water for fear of being eaten. Now, Manu was standing before something magnificent. The man who had once believed himself to be the protector was beginning to suspect that he had misunderstood the relationship from the very beginning. Perhaps Manu finally turned towards the fish and asked the question that had been growing within him since the creature first began its impossible transformation, because he now needed to know what stood before him and why such a being had entered his life disguised as something so small. The answer Manu was about to receive would change, well, everything. The fish had not come because it needed Manu to save it. It had come because the time was approaching when Manu would need the fish to save him. The peaceful world around Manu would not remain peaceful for much longer, because the great flood was approaching, and when those waters finally rose, they would not stop at the boundaries human beings had trusted throughout their lives. Manu was about to be given a warning. He was about to be told that he must prepare. He was about to discover that his encounter with the tiny fish had never been an accident. Most importantly, he was about to learn that when the waters came, saving himself would not be enough. Dearest gentle viewer, there must come a moment in every mystery when the person standing at the center can no longer pretend that what he is witnessing belongs to an ordinary world. And as for Manu, that moment arrived when the creature he had once carried so easily within his hands became so enormous that every new home he found for it seemed destined to become too small for the creature to exist in it. Manu had watched the transformation unfold before his own eyes, and although he had initially responded to each new difficulty with practical patience of a man attempting to honor his promise, there was only so long that even the most reasonable person could continue moving an impossibly growing fish from one body of water to another, without eventually wondering whether the creature itself had been waiting for him to ask the question that now occupied his entire mind. The little fish that had first asked Manu to protect him from the large creature that might devour it, and yet the being before him now seemed to have outgrown the very danger from which it once begged to be rescued, which meant that Manu could no longer understand why a creature possessing such extraordinary power had ever required his protection in the first place. Perhaps, as Manu stood watching the immense fish moving through the water, he began to remember every detail of their first encounter differently, because what had appeared to be a chance meeting now seemed strangely deliberate. And the simple request for protection began to feel less like the desperate plea of a frightened creature and more like the beginning of something that had been carefully arranged long before Manu understood that he had become a part of it. When Manu finally addressed the creature, there was perhaps no longer any point in asking how it had grown so quickly, because the answer to that question could never explain the greater mystery of what manner of being possessed the power to perform such a transformation. Manu therefore asked the question that had become impossible to avoid, and as he looked upon the extraordinary creature before him, he demanded to know who it truly was. The answer revealed that the being Manu had protected was no ordinary fish. The creature before him was connected to the divine power of Vishnu, the god of preservation, and the strange encounter that had begun when something tiny entered Manu's hands had been leading towards a purpose far greater than the protection of one small life. One can imagine the silence that followed during this revelation, because Manu might have looked at every moment of their strange companionship with a different point of view, with different eyes, and perhaps he remembered how carefully he had once carried the little fish to safety, believing himself responsible for protecting a helpless creature without realizing that he had been standing before a divine presence whose power exceeded everything he could understand. Yet Manu was given very little time to remain astonished by the revelation, because the reason for the fish's appearance was considerably more urgent than the mystery of its identity. A catastrophe was coming, and the world Manu knew was approaching a terrible flood. Waters would rise until the familiar boundaries between the river and land could no longer be trusted, and the destruction would be so vast that Manu would need to prepare before there was any visible sign that such a disaster was possible. One might imagine Manu turning instinctively towards the world around him, hearing this warning, because perhaps the sky remained calm and the land remained dry and the ordinary sound of life continued exactly as they had before, which must have made the words of the divine fish even more difficult to comprehend. Yet there's something deeply unsettling about being warned of a catastrophe while everything around you seems peaceful. Because a person standing beneath a violent storm requires no prophecy to know that danger has arrived, whereas Manu was being asked to believe that the calm world before his eyes concealed a future in which the waters would overwhelm everything he recognized. Perhaps Manu looked again towards the sky and asked when this destruction would come, while another question might surely have troubled him even more deeply, because if the flood would truly be as terrible as the fish suggested, he could not have been concerned only with his own survival. Then the sky began to change. The first clouds gathered with such ordinary innocence that no traveler would have paused to consider them remarkable. That has always been welcomed by farmers whose fields depend upon it. The rain began gently. One might imagine children watching the first drops strike the earth while elders smiled with satisfaction, believing that the season had arrived exactly as it should. Because nothing in those first moments suggested that nature had begun preparing itself for one of the greatest catastrophes remembered in ancient tradition. Yet, the rain did not end. The clouds did not scatter. The rivers that ordinarily accepted fresh rain with quiet gratitude began to swell beyond their familiar banks, while streams that had once flowed peacefully through villages suddenly acquired a force that no one living beside them had previously witnessed. At first, perhaps, people merely moved their belongings to higher grounds, believing that the winters would soon return to their accustomed paths, just as they always had, because human beings possess a remarkable confidence that yesterday's experience shall continue governing tomorrow's events, and it often requires repeated warnings before we finally accept that the world is changed. The waters, however, continued to rise. Fields that had fed entire communities slowly disappeared beneath the flood. Roads vanished one after another until travelers no longer recognized the paths they had walked throughout their lives, and the distance between river and land gradually ceased to exist as the water advanced with a patience more frightening than sudden violence, because it seemed determined to reclaim every place upon which humanity had once believed itself permanently established. One can imagine the growing confusion among those who had received no warning, because every familiar landmark that had guided their lives was disappearing before their own eyes, while the ordinary explanations upon which the dependent became increasingly inadequate to describe what was happening around them. Manu, however, did not stand among them in bewilderment. His heart must surely have been heavy with the knowledge that the warning had proved true, but at least he possessed something that the others did not possess, because preparation, however difficult it may have been, had replaced complete helplessness. The great vessel stood ready. Everything that the divine fish had instructed him to preserve had already been gathered, because Manu had understood that the purpose of the best was not merely to protect one man from drowning, but to ensure that when the waters eventually withdrew, there would still remain the possibility of life beginning once more. According to the account preserved in these pages, Manu entered the vessel carrying with him the seeds through which life would continue after the flood had passed. And this quiet detail possesses extraordinary importance because the story concerns not merely survival but continuity. Not merely escaping destruction but ensuring that destruction would not become permanent. The rain continued without mercy. The waters rose higher, and the boat, which had once rested securely upon the earth, now floated upon an ocean that seemed to possess no beginning and no end. One might imagine Manu standing within the vessel while looking towards every horizon in search of something familiar, only to discover that the world he had known had disappeared beneath an endless expanse of water in which mountains, forests, and kingdoms had become equally invisible. There is perhaps no loneliness greater than finding oneself surrounded by a world that no longer resembles the one remembered only days before, because every direction now appeared identical, and every attempt to determine where one might be seemed entirely hopeless. And yet, Manu remembered another promise. The divine fish had told him that when the floods reached its greatest fury, it would return. The boat, however strong it might be, could not simply drift aimlessly upon those immeasurable waters, because a vessel without guidance is little more than another object carried with wherever the current chooses to take it. The fish had instructed Manu that when it appeared, he should secure the vessel to its great horn with the help of the serpent Vasuki. One can imagine Manu searching the endless waters while the storm continued to rage around him, because although he trusted the promise that had been given to him, waiting possesses a curious ability to test even the strongest of faiths, particularly when every wave reminds a man how completely his own survival now depends upon something beyond his control. And then the waters before the vessel began to move. At first, the disturbance may have appeared no different from the countless waves already surrounding the boat, but it continued approaching with an extraordinary purpose until an immense form emerged from the depths, and the being that now stood before Manu bore almost no resemblance to the little fish that had once rested helplessly within his hands. The divine Matsya had returned. The transformation was complete, and the tiny creature that had once asked Manu for protection now possessed a form of such astonishing majesty that the raging waters themselves seemed unable to diminish its presence. Perhaps Manu remembered their first meeting with almost unbelievable clarity, because only then could he fully appreciate the extraordinary irony hidden within the story from its very beginning. Since the being who had first appeared as though it required protection and in reality been preparing itself to become the protector. Following the divine instruction, Manu secured the vessel to the great horn of Matsya with the serpent Vasuki, and as the mighty fish began moving through the immeasurable waters, the boat flowed faithfully behind him, while the flood that had overwhelmed the entire world could no longer determine the direction of their journey, because the divine itself had become their guide. Now, one might imagine the extraordinary silence that occasionally followed between the crashing waves, because although the storm remained fierce, Manu was no longer merely drifting wherever the flood wished to carry him, and there's a profound difference between being lost upon the sea and following someone who knows the way even when you yourself cannot yet see the destination. How long that journey continued, the story does not attempt to measure with ordinary human calculation of time, because certain journeys belong more naturally to memory than to mathematics, and perhaps what mattered most was not the number of days that passed, but the fact that throughout them all, the great fish never abandoned the vessel entrusted to its care. As Manu watched the endless waters stretching in every direction, another mystery was quietly approaching, because the flood itself, terrifying though it was, did not fully explain why Vishnu had chosen to appear as Matsya. The preservation of life formed one part of the divine purpose. Another part concerned the preservation of knowledge itself. Now, according to tradition, the sacred Vedas had been stolen by the demon Hayagriva during the period of cosmic dissolution, and without them, the restoration of the world after the flood would remain incomplete, because preserving life alone would not be sufficient if the wisdom required to guide that life had disappeared. The story therefore begins expanding beyond the survival of Manu, because the flood had threatened the continuation of living beings, while Hayagriva's theft threatened the preservation of sacred knowledge, and both dangers had to be overcome before creation could begin anew. One can almost picture the contrast between these two struggles, because upon the surface of the water, the great fish guided the vessel carrying the future of life, while elsewhere within those same immeasurable waters, another conflict concerning the future of knowledge was drawing steadily nearer. Manu may not yet have understood the full extent of this divine purpose, because his own attention remained fixed upon the survival of those entrusted to him. But the being leading the vessel steadily knew that restoring the world would require considerably more than ensuring that the flood eventually came to an end. Life without wisdom would merely repeat its mistakes, and a world rebuilt without the Vedas would lack the knowledge necessary to sustain the order that had once existed. The journey across the flood was therefore approaching its final and perhaps the most dramatic revelation, because the divine fish who had rescued Manu was now moving towards a confrontation that would determine whether the wisdom of creation itself would survive the catastrophe. The endless water still surrounded the boat in every direction. The familiar landmarks of the world had vanished beyond the flood, and the only certainty remaining was the steady movement of the great fish, whose immense form cut through the water with effortless strength, while the vessel followed securely behind. Fastened to its horn with the serpent, Vasuki. For what seemed as an immeasurable length of time, Manu watched nothing except water and sky. Days merged into nights, and nights again surrendered to mornings, until the ordinary way in which human beings count time no longer possessed much meaning. There were moments when the clouds lifted just enough for him to see the stars reflecting upon the endless ocean, and at such times it almost appeared as though the heavens themselves had descended into the water, leaving the little vessel suspended somewhere between two worlds. At last, unable to silence the questions that had been gathering within him since the beginning of the journey, Manu called out to the great fish. "My lord," he said, raising his voice above the sounding of the restless sea. "My lord, you warned me that these waters would come, and because I trusted your words, life has survived within the vessel. Yet one question continues to trouble me. If your purpose was only to save those who remained upon this boat, then why did you choose the form of a fish?" Surely the Lord of the universe could have appeared in any form he desired. For a few moments, Matsya continued moving silently through the waters, and Manu wondered whether his question had gone unheard, until the great fish answered in a voice so calm that it seemed untouched by the storm surrounding them. You believe this flood is the reason I came? Manu hesitated before replying. I believed it was. It is only part of the reason. The answer surprised him. If there's another purpose, Manu asked, then I beg you to tell me, because I cannot see beyond these waters. You cannot, replied Matsya gently, because you are looking only at what has been lost, while I must also protect what cannot be seen. I do not understand. You soon shall. The boat continued forward, and although nothing upon the horizon appeared different from what Manu had already seen countless times before, he sensed that the journey itself had begun to change. There was now a quiet certainty in the voice of the divine fish that suggested their destination was drawing near, and the strange anticipation that settled over him was unlike anything he had experienced since the flood began. After some time, Matsya slowed. The waters here seemed darker. The waves rose differently, and though something beneath the surface disturbed the sea itself, and Manu instinctively found himself gripping the side of the boat with his eyes search the restless ocean. My lord, he asked, what lies beneath us? The reason I came. The answer lingered in the silence before them. Before Manu could ask another question, the sea erupted. The surface burst apart with such force that water rose high into the air, and from those churning depths emerged a terrifying presence unlike anything Manu had ever witnessed. It was neither the flood nor the storm that caused his heart to race, but the unmistakable feeling that the creature before him carried within it a darkness entirely different from the violence of nature. Without taking his eyes away from the creature resting before him, Manu spoke almost in a whisper. Who is he? The one who believed that wisdom could be stolen. Only then did Matsya reveal what had remained hidden until that moment. During the Great Dissolution, while the world had been swallowed by the waters, the sacred Vedas themselves had been taken away by a demon named Hayagriva, who believed that if divine knowledge disappeared, creation itself would awaken into ignorance when the flood eventually ended. The preservation of life alone could never restore the world completely, because without the wisdom contained in the Vedas, human beings would inherit a future without the knowledge required to sustain it. Manu listened in stunned silence. So while I believed you were leading us to safety, I was also leading you towards something that must be recovered, Matsya completed gently. The demon rose higher above the waters, and even from the safety of the vessel, Manu could sense the terrible confidence with which he regarded the endless ocean around him, as though he believed the flood had made him the master of the world from which all order had vanished. One can almost imagine Manu's thoughts in that moment, because only a short while earlier he had believed that surviving the flood was the greatest challenge before them. And now he discovered that survival itself would be meaningless if knowledge remained imprisoned in the hands of one who wished creation to begin again in darkness. My lord, Manu said quietly, will there be war? There already has been, Matsya replied. You are only now seeing its final chapter. What followed belonged not to the struggles of ordinary kings, but to the timeless conflict between preservation and destruction. The great fish moved through the waters with extraordinary speed, and the ocean that had moments earlier seemed endless now became the battlefield upon which the future of creation itself would be decided. Manu could do nothing except watch. There are moments in every life where action belongs to the others, and wisdom consists not in interfering, but in witnessing events whose scale exceeds human strength. Standing within the boat that carried the future of life, Manu understood that his own task had been obedience, while the task before Matsya belonged to the divine alone. The waters churned violently around them. Great waves rose and crashed as though the ocean itself had become restless in anticipation of what was about to occur, and somewhere amidst that immense struggle, the sacred Vedas were recovered from Hayagriva, ensuring that when the flood finally ended, The new world would inherit not only life but also the wisdom necessary to guide it. As calm gradually returned to the sea, Manu looked once more upon the great fish, and it seemed to him that he finally understood the strange path by which destiny had led them together. The little fish had once begged for protection beside a quiet river and had never truly needed saving. Instead, it had patiently taught an old man that compassion shown towards even the smallest is never wasted. Because had Manu dismissed the tiny creature on the riverbank, believing it too insignificant to deserve his attention, the future of the world itself would have slipped from his hands before he even realized that it had arrived. The storm was beginning to pass, and the waters that had swallowed the earth would not remain forever, and somewhere beyond the endless horizon a new beginning awaited for the moment when land would once again emerge from beneath the sea. And yet, before Manu stepped into this new world, there remained one final lesson hidden within this remarkable story. A lesson not about floods or demons, not even about divine incarnations, but about why our ancestors chose to preserve this tale across generations and what they believed it still had to teach those who would hear it. Dearest gentle viewer, when the waters finally began to withdraw and the boat came gently to rest, one imagines that Manu did not step immediately into the earth. After spending so long surrounded by nothing except the endless movement of the sea, he must have stood quietly for a while, looking at the land before him almost as though he was seeing the world for the first time. The mountains were no longer simply mountains. The trees were no longer merely trees, and the ordinary sound of birds returning to the sky must have carried a meaning that only someone who had watched an entire world disappear could truly understand. The great fish had fulfilled every promise it had made. The seeds had survived, life had survived, and the sacred knowledge that had been stolen had been restored. The journey at last had come to an end. One likes to imagine Manu standing before the divine being with a gratitude too deep to be expressed easily in words. Because there are moments in life when language suddenly becomes inadequate. After all that had happened, what could one possibly say? How does a man thank the one who has carried not merely his own life but the future of generations he will never meet? Perhaps Manu simply bowed. Perhaps silence itself became his prayer. But perhaps the great fish, whose first appearance had been so small that it rested within the palms of his hands, disappeared once more into the water with the same quiet mystery with which it had first arrived, leaving Manu standing alone beneath the open sky that suddenly seemed much larger than it had before. It is here that most stories would end. A hero survives, the danger passes, the world begins again. But our ancestors were curious people. They rarely told a story merely to describe what happened, and they almost always asked another question after the story was over. And somehow that second question has managed to survive just as long as the story itself. Why did Vishnu become a fish? It's such an unusual choice that one cannot help returning to it again and again. He could have come as a king commanding mighty armies, or as a warrior capable of defeating every enemy, or as a sage whose wisdom illuminated the darkness of the world, and yet he chose the one form that almost no one would have expected. Perhaps because the smallest creature upon the riverbank was the one most likely to be ignored, and perhaps that is exactly where the story wishes to surprise us. For Manu's destiny did not begin when the flood arrived. It began much earlier, on an ordinary morning when he decided that the life of one insignificant creature mattered enough for him to interrupt his own plans. Had he looked at the little fish with impatience, had he smiled dismissively before returning it to the river, believing that such a tiny life could make no difference to the world, the story would have ended before it had even truly begun. How strange it is that history should turn upon an act so small. Perhaps that is because life itself behaves in much the same way. We spend so much of our lives waiting for extraordinary moments that we almost overlook the ordinary ones. Although it is often those quiet encounters, those brief conversations, those seemingly unimportant decisions made on perfectly ordinary mornings that gently alter the direction of everything that follows. Looking backwards, we call them turning points. While living through them, we rarely notice them at all. And then there's the flood. People have debated for centuries whether such a flood truly covered the whole earth, and perhaps it did, while perhaps it belonged to that mysterious space where history and memory meet one another. It's remarkable that the storytellers themselves never appear anxious about proving it because they seem far more interested in another thought altogether. Every age has its flood, not always of water. Sometimes an age is overwhelmed by violence, sometimes by pride, sometimes by greed, sometimes by forgetting that civilizations do not disappear only beneath oceans. They disappear whenever the things that hold them together are allowed to slip quietly away until one day people suddenly discover that the familiar world they entrusted had vanished without their noticing when the change began. Perhaps that is why Manu carried seeds into the boat. The image is so simple that one almost misses its beauty. Seeds are amongst the smallest things a person can hold, and yet, hidden within each of them sleeps an entire forest waiting for its season. Our ancestors must surely have known this, and perhaps that is why they chose seeds instead of jewels or crowns or treasures. Because wealth can rebuild palaces, but only a seed can rebuild a living world. There's something profoundly hopeful about that image. The future does not begin with something enormous. It begins with something small that survives. The same thought returns once more when the Vedas are recovered. The story could easily have ended with the survival of life, and yet it insists that life alone is not enough. The world must also remember. Wisdom must survive alongside humanity, because what value would there be in saving generations if each generation were condemned to begin again in complete ignorance, repeating every mistake because nothing had been carried safely across the flood? Perhaps that is why stories mattered so much to the people who once told them. Empires rise and fall, languages change, cities disappear, even mighty kingdoms eventually become little more than broken stones waiting for archaeologists. But stories travel differently. They pass from grandmother to child, from teacher to student, from one traveler to another beside an evening of fire, carrying within them not merely entertainment but memory itself. Long after palaces have fallen into dust, a story continues walking quietly through history, waiting patiently for another listener. And perhaps that is the greatest miracle hidden within Matsyaavatar, when Vishnu became a fish. Not that a fish became large enough to guide a boat across an endless oceans, that's just imagery. Not even that the flood eventually came to an end. The greatest miracle may simply be that thousands of years later, people still gather to hear the story, still wonder about the little fish upon the riverbank, still find themselves asking, while compassion shown to someone apparently insignificant should matter so much. Perhaps because our ancestors understood something wonderfully human. The world is rarely saved all at once. It's usually saved exactly as Manu saved it, by recognizing the value of something small before everyone else had realized how important it truly is. And when one thinks about it in that way, the story no longer feels ancient at all. It feels as though it has been quietly waiting for every generation, including our own. And so, life flourished again. The flood had become a distant memory. The earth, washed clean by the great water, stretched quietly beneath the morning sun again. And for the first time in what must have felt like an eternity, Manu stood once again upon solid ground. Behind him rested the great vessel that had carried the hope of the world, while before him lay a landscape that looked strangely familiar and yet entirely new, as though creation itself had taken a long breath before beginning once more. The great fish still floated peacefully upon the water, and for a long while neither of them spoke. There are moments that silence says everything that words cannot. At last, Manu folded his hands and bowed. "My lord," he said softly, "when I first found you, I believed I was saving a helpless creature from the river. I know now that from the very beginning it was you who had come to save me. Tell me one thing before you leave." The great fish looked upon him with the same calm eyes that had first met him beside the river. "What troubles your heart, Manu?" Manu was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Why me?" There were kings more powerful than I, sages wiser than I, warriors braver than I. Why did you place the future of the world into my hands? The waters lapped gently against the shore before Matsya answered. I did not choose you because you were the strongest. I chose you because when a life no larger than your own hand asked for mercy, you did not ask what reward you would receive. You simply chose compassion. Manu lowered his eyes. It seemed such a small thing. So do seeds. Manu looked at the handful of seeds resting beside the great vessel. They are so small, he whispered. They are, Vishnu replied. And yet forests sleep within them. Rivers wait for them. Birds that have not yet been born shall one day rest in their branches. Never measure the worth of anything by its size, Manu. The smallest things often carry the greatest futures. Manu remained silent. Another question had quietly found its way into his heart. My lord, will the world remember this flood? Vishnu smiled. Some will remember it as history. Others, they'll remember it as a story. And which is true? The answer, Vishnu said gently, will matter less than what the story teaches. Manu frowned. What does it teach? The great fish turned slowly towards the endless waters, that every age has its flood, not always of water. Sometimes the flood is pride, greed, sometimes hatred, sometimes forgetfulness, sometimes bigotry. Every generation believes its world will last forever until the waters begin to rise around it. Manu listened without interrupting. And every generation, Vishnu continued, must decide what it will carry safely into the future. The morning breeze moved softly across the river. The Vedas survived, yet. The seeds survived, yes. And life survived, yes. Manu looked at the world around him and smiled. Then everything was saved. For the first time since the conversation had begun, Vishnu gently shook his head. No, Manu. No? The world is never saved once. Manu looked at him in surprise. It is saved again and again and again. Every time someone chooses wisdom instead of ignorance, compassion instead of cruelty, and truth instead of convenience, the world is saved. Neither of them spoke for a long time. And then the great fish slowly turned towards the deeper waters. It's time. You are leaving? My work is finished. And mine? That has only begun. With those words, the divine form disappeared beneath the water as quietly as it had first appeared beside the river, leaving behind only widening circles upon the surface until even they became still. Manu remained standing on the shore, watching the place where Matsya had vanished, and perhaps after a very long time he smiled. Not because the world would never again know sorrow, but because he finally understood that every new beginning asks only one simple question of those who inherit it. What will you choose to preserve?